And we're live.
Hello, and welcome to another DML Commons webinar. This is the wrap-up webinar of Unit 3 for the DML Commons Professional Pathway. Our unit was entitled, If at First You Don't Succeed, Try Again, or the ins and outs of academic writing and publishing. Today we're going to be answering your questions that you posted in the Etherpad about writing and publishing. I'm Crystle Martin, a postdoctoral researcher at the Digital Media and Learning Hub at the University of California, Irvine. And I'll be co-facilitating the webinar with Amanda Ochsner from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And given that our discussion will partly be on collaborative writing, we hope that you will collaborate with us and add any questions you have to the Etherpad or use the hashtag DMLCommons. And please go ahead and add your name under the roll call section so we know who's here. We're also going to ask that if you have any of your own answers for these questions, to jump in and add them on the Etherpad. So we're going to start and talk about kind of three general topics: writing process, collaboration, and then communicating your work. And we're going to start with writing process. And the first question we're going to tackle that was asked was, how do you approach the writing process?
All right, I'll kick us off with that. So I've been writing a lot recently. I just finished up my dissertation, and I did a article book chapter format dissertation. So writing is something that I've been doing a lot of. And one thing I want to talk about is a book that I read recently that really has informed my process a lot. I read a book at the end of last year called How to Write a Lot by Paul Sylvia, and I put a few quotes, if you're following along in the Etherpad, I included a few of my favorite quotes from that book in there, so feel free to check those out. But one of the things that he really hits on is that you don't find time to write. If you approach writing as something that you have to find time for, he would argue you're doing it wrong. And so he really advocates for having a writing schedule. And so that's something that I set up for myself after reading it and realizing, you know, I have a timeline for this dissertation, I want to get it done. So I set up writing blocks, and so that was blocking off time in my calendar and then saying this time is for writing. So I installed a pause button on my inbox so that I wouldn't get distracted by every incoming email. And I would even sort of force myself to turn off my GChat, Gmail chat, and stuff like that. And one of the things I found really useful was assigning a goal to each particular writing block. So that was, you know, a couple weeks ahead of time, or at least 1 week ahead of time. For every writing session that I had on my calendar, I put a specific concrete goal, and that might have been, work on X chunk or chapter. Some days it's something like write that review for a journal that I've been kind of putting off. And so by setting specific goals for each session, I found that I stopped procrastinating on the tasks that I didn't want to do. So if there was something that I didn't really feel like getting to, it really worked for me when I said, oh, well, it looks like it's assigned for today, and it's not assigned for any other days on my block, so I either do it today or it's going to mess everything up on my schedule. And so that really helped me kind of keep on track for a lot of the ongoing projects I had. And then another thing that I thought was really smart about the way he talked about scheduling was he really said you need to defend your writing schedule. Sylvia suggested thinking about your writing time just like your teaching time. You would never not show up to a class you teach because other things came up or because you had an impromptu meeting. You don't schedule meetings over your teaching, and so he says also don't schedule meetings or other things over your writing time. Don't think of that as stuff that writing is the thing that you do if other things don't come up. You really need to sort of be defensive about it. So those were some things that I thought were really useful in terms of what he talked about. He also talks about setting up a spreadsheet to keep track of your writing. That's not something that I've started doing yet, but I think for some people that's a really useful thing. So those are kind of some things that have affected my writing process of late. And now I'd love to hear a little bit about the way Crystle approaches writing.
Well, I do a lot of similar things to you. I actually block off time on my schedule. I used to do like the same block in the morning, every morning, but I found that if I did that over time, that eventually I'd just start scheduling stuff over it, and other things would come up, and I just wouldn't make time for it. So I have a tendency the week before to schedule in blocks around the other things I'm doing and then take up those kind of chunks of extra time. And, sometimes it's a 2 or 3 hour block, sometimes it's an hour block. I also find I write really well really early in the morning. So if I have the option, I'll get up early and start writing at like 6:30 or 7, and I end up with more productive hours so I can get writing that early. And I also find that I do best if I write in Google Docs all the time, because that way if I end up with an extra chunk of time that I can use for writing, I can always access my writing no matter where I am, and that way I can do it most efficiently.
I like how you mentioned that you have a time of day, and I think that really worked for me. I also found right away in the morning to be the best time. I know some academics that I know who are really prolific, successful writers even say they write for several hours before they'll go into campus, and that is their time, and you won't hear from them, and you won't receive emails from them, and they get that out of the way, and then they move on to the rest of their day, which is email, teaching, meetings, and things like that. So for me, I get up, I grab a cup of coffee, and right away I'm writing at home. But other people, like my partner, do much better later in the day. Me, I can't write after 8 o'clock to save my life anymore in the evenings. But some people, that's their best time. So I think keeping that in mind as you set things like a schedule is really important, to have it work around the commitments you can't move around, especially if you have another job or you have a family. There are certain things that, you can't defend your writing time from. But, figuring out how to work around your schedule, I think, is really useful for sure. Crystle, do you have anything to add before we move on?
I think we can go on.
Okay. So our next question is about your strategies for requesting feedback from others. Are there certain people that you share early drafts with, and then others who you go to, when you're struggling, like with an intellectual wall? What's your approach for getting feedback from other people, Crystle?
Well, I have tendency to use a small group of scholars, a lot of them who I've written with collaboratively before, which I'll go to first when I need feedback. And over time, like as I've progressed, the group has kind of grown, and I have both scholars who are, I would say, in my same field, even though, I do sort of boundary research, but that are in my same field, as well as scholars who are outside of my field. And I usually start with one person and get early feedback on ideas, and then oftentimes, paper exchanges with people who are kind of in my immediate circle of, collaborators that I would normally collaborate with, but if I'm writing it myself, that's how I search out people to get feedback from. And I never feel shy, I guess, about asking for help and feedback. I think it's an important part of writing, and so for me it's a natural inclination to go and talk to people about the ideas that I'm thinking about and solicit feedback as writing goes on. What about you?
I like what you have to say about not being shy about it, and I think that's a hard thing for a lot of people. Putting yourself out there for feedback can be really intimidating, and so I think finding just a couple people, even if it's just like 2 people who you really trust to see some of your messy, not best work. I would say you're probably one of those people for me, who's just good for an insanity check. I actually recently sent Crystle a piece of writing, and I was like, will you just skim this and tell me, does it look like it's supposed to? Because sometimes you get a little bit paranoid if you're waiting. If say, I know some people, other graduate students who I've talked to, sometimes have to wait months for feedback from their advisors on writing. And you can start to, I think, get a little bit paranoid. And so even having a few people who maybe even you aren't asking for substantial feedback from, but just for even brief sanity checks, I think can be really helpful. And then I would also recommend finding someone who you work with over time. Crystle and I have been reading each other's writing and giving feedback on each other's writing for several years now. And so part of it is then I don't feel guilty because I've read so much of her stuff and she's read so much of mine. I don't think we feel guilty asking each other for things, but in a new part of a writing relationship, you might feel like, oh, I don't know, this person's so busy and I feel really bad asking to take up their time right now. And so having somebody who's sort of established a rapport with and have a history with, I think really helps you to not say, avoid it because you feel guilty or because you're intimidated by it. So I think that's something that's really important, and it takes time, but if you can find those 1 or 2 people you can always go to, I would highly recommend trying to establish a relationship like that.
Absolutely, and I would say that that finding somebody who has a similar writing style, which I think you and I over time, having written together before, like we share a similar writing style, and so especially when you're in, I think, the early parts of writing, if you have someone with you that you've had this long-term rapport with, you don't feel like you're burdening them, because it can feel like a burden to give someone an entire paper and ask for feedback, but the partnership is really important, and I think sharing similar writing styles is very helpful, because then they have an idea of, how you approach writing and, the kind of pitfalls that you may get into based on their own experience. And so that kind of helps you suss out early issues in writing, I would say.
Absolutely. One other thing that I guess I've done on and off, and that I know a lot of people find useful, is having a writing group that meets regularly. And if you're a grad student on a campus, most campuses, I would say, have something like that, or if not, get something set up. I know there's a chapter in Sylvia's How to Write book about his writing group and how he set it up. I know on my campus at the University of Wisconsin, the Writing Center has opportunities for writing groups or resources about how to set it up. And I know, like our Writing Center, you can actually, if you're a dissertator working on a dissertation, you can set up a consultation with the same Writing Center consultant every week or every other week, depending on your needs. I was lucky enough to attend a writing camp back in January. At Wisconsin, we had a Mellon dissertation writing camp, which I was able to apply for and got in. And so for a week in January, I spent a whole week writing with other people who were also working on their dissertations. And so every morning we would check in with our goals and talk. We'd have like a short seminar or workshop or meeting, and then we'd spend the whole day writing together. And sometimes just writing in the room with someone can be really helpful. When I started to burn out at camp, when it was like an hour or two after lunch, and I was like, I think I'm done for today, I would look over and see the other 2 or 3 people sharing the room with me, and they're there, fingers to keyboard, headphones on, working, and that was sometimes enough to help me get just another chunk done when I felt like maybe I was too burned out.
I think the Writing Center thing is also a good point, because even as a postdoc, not all the same resources are available to postdocs, but at least at UCI, postdocs can actually go to the Graduate Center, the Graduate Writing Center, and so looking for those kind of opportunities on campus, if you even if you already have like an established writing partner that you get feedback from, I think it's also a great way to kind of get a fresh look at your writing and get some advice that I think switching it up every once, like getting the outside feedback like from your writing camp also kind of gives you a new perspective on your writing, which is very helpful, I think, for getting a different kind of feedback than you might not normally get in your normal channels.
Yeah, I'm a huge advocate of writing centers, and I'm a little bit biased. I worked as a writing center consultant when I was an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, and that was really great. And I would say, it's easy to think, oh, well, this writing center consultant doesn't know my work. They aren't an expert in my field. And that's true. They probably aren't an expert in your field. So they may not be able to point out specific gaps in your literature review or problematize a specific theory that maybe, you aren't sure if you're using it correctly or framing it correctly. And you'll need other readers for that. But in terms of helping you with how you might organize a piece of writing better or issues of clarity, somebody at the Writing Center can be really useful for that. So don't be shy about, making that a first appointment or even just going to check out and see what services your Writing Center has.
So our next question is about journal articles, and it says, journal articles are really hard to write because they're so long and terrifying and they feel really high stakes. So what are good strategies for getting over that fear and avoidance? Because it's so much easier to write a conference submission.
Oh, it is, and I think that's why we do so many more of them. That's a really great question. Part of it is just you've got to sit down and do it. If you take our advice of setting goals for each session, then make sure that that's a regular part of one of your goals. For me, when I set goals ahead of time, it really helped me get rid of that behavior of making excuses for the types of writing I didn't want to do. Because when you go in and you're like, I should write, and then you're like, okay, what are the things I could write? You're going to go with the thing that you want to write. But if you've actually said on, maybe the second week of this month, I'm going to commit all of my writing sessions or half of my writing sessions to getting a draft of this article down, then I think that's really useful. And I would say get the draft down would be my best advice. What do you think, Crystal?
Well, I'd say that that's a great strategy, and also there's nothing wrong with starting with a conference submission or a blog post as a sort of way to ease yourself into it. And then, for me sometimes I go a very formulaic approach. Like if I'm going to think about writing a journal article, I go and figure out which journal I'd like it to go to, and then I figure out what their formatting is, and then I kind of build myself a framework and then write into the framework. And that kind of helps me sometimes get over the hesitation of starting the articles. I'm like, okay, I know that the abstract has to be this long, and these are the sections that they want, and then I start kind of building into kind of a skeleton, and that kind of eases into it a little bit more, as opposed to the fear of the white page, the blank page, and then trying to make the blank page into a journal article. So I think that there's good ways that you can scaffold yourself into it to kind of help ease in. But I definitely think doing a conference submission is a great place to start, because then at least you have something to build from, and then, because the conference submission feels much less high stakes when you write the smaller chunk first.
One strategy that I tried this spring was, once I had selected a target journal for a manuscript that I had started or was planning to write, I looked for one or two articles recently published in one of the recent issues of that journal, and once I found something that I liked, I tried to identify, okay, what did I like about this, and I tried to kind of copy their structure a little bit. How much time did they dedicate to the literature review? How did they transition into their theoretical framework? And so if you can find a piece that you really enjoy reading that was published in a specific journal that you're going for, then that can be really useful too, in terms of providing some sort of signposts and guidelines for how you might get started and get your own draft down. All right. I think our next question is about reviewer comments, particularly how you approach comments from reviewers that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, or you think maybe they misinterpreted what you were writing. Crystle, how would you say you approach that?
Well, I think it's important to respond thoughtfully to reviewer comments. So even if you get a comment that you feel is maybe off base, or that they misinterpreted what you said, I think the best way to respond is to give them a very thoughtful explanation of what it was you were trying to convey that they may have, that you may feel that they have missed. I also think that sometimes if you think that a reviewer comment is off base or wrong, it's helpful to have someone else read that, at least that section, if not the paper, and then read the reviewer comment and then give you their thoughts on it. Because sometimes, you've written the paper and you know what the paper says to you, and you know it so strongly that you may not have noticed that it could have been, like, there could be a spot in there that the reviewer had interpreted that way, but others could also interpret it that way. And so I think taking into consideration, even if your knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, that reviewer's completely off base, they didn't understand my point, et cetera, is to have someone else read it and also see if they could see both, either the point you were going for, the reviewer's point, or both, and then think about how you can actually restructure the text and then also respond to the reviewer to explain, like, the point you were really going for, and how you're going to make a change in order to help clear that up for other readers.
I really like what you said about what it says to you, and I think that's kind of an important thing to remember. You are the most familiar with your work of anyone, but sometimes receiving reviews, particularly negative reviews, can be really emotional. And so I find that my first reaction is usually a pretty emotional one, and I need to give it some time and sort of put it away and then come back to it after I've sort of processed through the emotions I have about it, and then go back and go, okay, more objectively, what did they have to say? And if they have criticisms or if they misinterpreted something, it probably means that you could be more clear about it. It doesn't mean that you did it terribly wrong or something like that, but it might mean that there are ways that you could add clarifications. And sometimes you have to remember that, not everyone is as fully immersed in your ideas and your thought process as you are. And so, sometimes being a little bit more humble than you initially feel like you need to be is a good strategy if you can bring yourself there. Be forgiving with yourself, but also, remember that those criticisms probably have some validity to them, and that it will make you a stronger writer to take those things seriously, even though it's not easy.
Yeah, and I would say, just like Danny Hero had mentioned in our first webinar, that I also have to be in the right mood for reviewer comments. I have to be in a good place, and then I can read them, and then I have to put them away. And I try to never start making the reviewer comments immediately. I like to give myself at least a couple days, if not a week, to have read the reviewer comments and stew on it. And then I like to go back through, read the whole paper, read the reviewer comments, and then start making the edits, because I think it's very easy to let the emotional reaction of being defensive or being upset both color how you're reading the comments as well as how you're responding to them, both in changes in the text as well as in written responses to the reviewer. And you don't have to make every change that every reviewer suggests, and sometimes you get contradictory changes from two different reviewers, and then you have to figure out personally which one you think works best with the paper. And then for the reviewer's comment that you've decided not to change, you have to justify your reason for not making the change. And a lot of times it's a simple justification of after making other changes, this change was going to affect the flow of the paper in some way, and you have to write for each specific context. But I do think that giving yourself time to process and let that first emotional reaction go is really important to being able to actually address the reviewer comments in a really thoughtful and very productive way.
Absolutely. And just one other quick thing. Not every time is the right time to read reviews and reviewer comments on your stuff. I received an email that I knew was an accept reject notification and that it was going to have feedback, but it was early morning and I was in San Francisco at the Game Developers Conference, and I knew I had a 13-hour day of collecting interviews for my dissertation data and attending sessions and networking, and I wasn't quite sure what was going to be in that email. And if you don't know and the timing isn't right, sometimes it's better to say, I'm going to read this later, if it isn't going to drive you crazy. If you know that it might put you off track for whatever that you have to do that day, sometimes saying, I'll get to this later is an okay response for when you decide to read that stuff.
Absolutely. I try not to read them in the middle of a day full of meetings or on a day where I'm already under a lot of stress, because they're never it's never that pressing. If it's a accept or a reject or a revise, there's always going to be a month or two that you have to do it, and so wait till you've got the time to actually do it, and not do it when you're already rushed or under a lot of pressure. So the next question is, how do you iterate from outline to paper to final paper, and how is your process different when you're single author on a piece versus collaborative?
Good question. Collaborating is a really different process because it really requires communication. And so I think the most important thing about collaborative writing is putting out expectations for how you're going to handle the piece right away at the outset. When you're writing with yourself, there's a little bit of room to decide, oh, this strategy doesn't work, we need to switch gears. But when you're working with someone, I think you need to establish a pretty clear plan at the beginning, and then if you think it's not working, really kind of step in with your authors and check in with each other every once in a while and say, all right, is our process working? Where are our initial goals? Are they still on point? Do we need to make any revisions to that? But I would say communicating clearly rather than making assumptions is a really important thing when you're working with collaborators.
And I would say iterating for me it works very similarly from a single author piece to a collaborative piece. It's always um, start with an outline, start building in the outline, and then you keep making passes through the document over and over. But I would say the difference is that as a collaborative piece, oftentimes multiple people may be working on the text at once, but when it comes to reviewing, one person reads it, the next person reads it. So you get a whole lot of feedback, that you're all the authors on the piece, but you get to share your thoughts on the finished document together as the process goes on. Whereas a single author piece, oftentimes you're giving feedback to yourself for a lot of the process, but then I almost always go and try to find my outside readers to give me feedback kind of in a really fairly early stage and then in a more finished stage to kind of help, mold the paper as it goes. And even with the collaborative, like working collaboratively as part of the process, it's always good to have someone outside the collaboration read the paper, because at a certain point, you've all been in there so long and working on the same paper that you might not see, something that needs to be changed. For example, recently I was working on a collaborative paper that it had taken us probably about a year to finish. And we'd gone through it so many times, and then I had some of the collaborators that I work with here read through it, and they had pointed out that there was this section in the literature review that we had just hung on to through so many versions, and actually it was a framing thing. We had been trying to fit everything into a framework that didn't quite work, and it was like remove this one chunk of the framework was the solution, but those of us working on the paper just couldn't see it because we've been working on the same framework for so long that you just can't see those kind of simple solutions that really make a paper stronger. And so the outside feedback is always super helpful.
All right, I think this is a good time then to transition to our second section on collaboration, since that's kind of the key focus of our next section. So, Crystle, one of the things I want to ask is, in collaborative writing, authors oftentimes come from different disciplines or different areas of focus. And so how would you say you arrive at the best way to frame things like your literature review or your key arguments when you're each used to speaking to slightly different audiences or slightly different academic discourses?
Well, I think one of the easiest ways is to start with where you're going to publish the article to begin with. So when you pick a journal, they have a certain audience that they're used to writing, that is their audience, and that are used to a certain type of writing. And so select your journal, read some of the articles that they've already published, and then even though you're all coming from different disciplines and they have different sets of literature that you would normally pull in, you're going to want to use literature that's going to speak well to that journal. And so, you can let the journal kind of help you move through that process, because it can be difficult, if you come from three different academic disciplines, you're going to all bring in different literature on, the same sorts of topic. You can also have some really interesting conversations and bring that literature together and get some great cross-disciplinary development in your framework if we're working through those kind of things. But if it's a roadblock or if it doesn't meld well, then I would say let the journal kind of help you mold that at the beginning to especially your literature review. The key argument, I think, is something that you'll have to work out amongst the collaborators, but the literature review can help you at least pushed in a direction by where you plan on publishing it.
Fantastic response. I don't really think I have anything to add to that. You covered it.
So going on with the collaboration, are there specific digital tools that you use for collaborative work and collaborative writing? And how do you assemble digital tools for collaboration that meet various needs?
I think this was a question that came up in our webinar last week when we had our panel, and I think we discovered that pretty much everyone who we had on our panel and us too are big users of Google Docs. And I think I would say that when collaborating, Google Docs are definitely there's nothing worse than the version control nightmare that comes from, like, I know before Google Docs were a really prominent thing, I was working on a collaborative project where you're sending versions back and forth, and somebody might have been editing an older version that's out of date, and then they send edits. Crystle, I think you and I worked on a project once where that happened, where somebody had made edits on a version that was like 2 or 3 versions old, and then we received that, and we didn't even know what to do with it at that point. And so, always have a system, and if you do decide to use, file documents instead of something like Google Docs, go for it. But the nice thing about a Google Doc is you can jump back to earlier iterations if you need to, but you always have right away the most up-to-date current thing. And I would say using comments is also really important. The nice thing about Google Docs is you can comment right in the margins, and you can highlight specific chunks for what you're talking about, and so it just makes having a conversation much easier, particularly if you aren't all writing from the same physical space, the same room.
And I would say that if you do decide to use Word docs, then everybody needs to agree on the versioning naming scheme, so that way when the document gets sent back and forth, everybody actually knows which one is the most current version, because if everybody's using slightly different naming schemes, then it becomes more and more difficult over time to determine which one is actually the last document. And along with that, somebody, usually the first author, needs to keep track of who's got the document now if it's being passed back and forth, because that's the other way that you lose control of versioning. If 2 different people think that they have the most recent version, and then they both make changes, then you end up spending a lot of time incorporating those 2 changes into the same document, which is a lot of extra work. To add on to that, the person who asked wanted to know that teams that use Google Docs for the drafting process and for iterative feedback, how do you deal with the idea of publicly privileging comments of senior researchers over others? And I would say that if you're working collaboratively, A, seeing everybody's comments is very helpful for everybody's writing process, and B, I would say that you need to be on a working level where you're not viewing it like that, because just because you have a senior researcher who you're writing for or writing with doesn't necessarily mean that if they make a comment that privileges it over everyone else's. And besides, senior researchers usually have more writing experience, and so everyone on the team can benefit from those comments as well as from sharing their own thoughts about different parts of the writing process. And so it needs to feel like a conversation and not like you're having a paper graded, I think.
Absolutely. And one more thing I would add is, in a collaborative process, it's good to have a certain point where you delegate the final version to a specific person. At some point, somebody needs to say, this is our final version, I'm going to make the final edits, I'll incorporate this last bit of feedback we have, and then I'm going to submit this thing. Making sure that you have a sort of plan for who's going to wrap everything up and pass it off to the next step, whether that's submitting it or whatever it is. It's a good idea to sort of have a plan for who's responsible for that, so you aren't in that scenario where you're writing right up until the deadline, you've got this submission, and people keep giving feedback, and it's due in like an hour, and then you're like, oh crap, how are we gonna get this in? Who's responsible for that? So having a certain like cutoff time where you're like, and now we're done, and so is going to take it and submit it, I think really kind of helps get rid of some of that last minute chaos that comes up, particularly when you're writing right up against a deadline.
So how do you handle conflicting preferences among collaborators?
Yeah, we all have our different writing styles, so that's kind of a tricky one. I actually, we were just talking about deadlines, and that's one of the things that I think has been the hardest for me on collaborative projects is not being on the same page about how you intend to meet a deadline. Some people are chronic procrastinators. I would say a lot of academics are, and maybe that's even a norm. Crystle and I have both co-chaired a conference, so I think we know what percentage of submissions come in at the very last minute. When you're running a conference, it's easy, a few days before submissions are due to think, oh my gosh, no one's going to submit to our conference, no one's going to go, it's going to be a complete disaster. And of course that isn't the case, it's just that almost everyone waits until the last minute. And I find particularly when I'm writing with other people, we never get things in early. It always goes in the day that it's due. When I'm writing by myself, sometimes I get lucky and I'm able to get something in early and then move on to other things. But when you're working with other people, it's much harder to do that because you have more of those iterative feedback cycles. And some people go in with the expectation that if it's due at 10 o'clock p.m. in such and such time zone, you're going to submit it sometime between 9:30 and 10 o'clock p.m. that evening. And so I think talking about your expectations for when you're going to have drafts done, when you're going to have feedback for each other, and when you're going to submit it is a way to alleviate a lot of the frustrations. Because I think lack of not being on the same page about deadlines throughout the process is what causes me the most frustration when working with collaborators.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that it's about managing expectations, and you really need to think about how you're going to handle the whole process. So whoever is going to turn it in, they should get the say as to when all the edits need to be to them by and how much time they need to make any final revisions and actually get it submitted. And so kind of trying to determine that ahead of time is definitely the best method. It isn't always practical and it doesn't always work, but it's definitely something to attempt to do. And there's also, especially if you have academics of different disciplines working on the same paper, you can get conflicting preferences among what's considered standard literature to use in certain types of writing, and that's definitely something that's much more difficult to solve, I think, but a lot of it is worked out through long conversations, I think, is the best way to go. Piece that I wrote that probably had about 12 authors on it. We had one author who had a slightly different academic background than the rest of us, and so we had a lot of long discussions about how exactly we described our claims in the paper, because certain words from the other discipline triggered, a different set of expectations, or that they conjured up different ideas than what we were trying to say. And so in order to both include that person and yet still have the product we wanted, there's a lot of conversations, a lot of discussion about word choice and how you're going to present those findings in the end to accommodate all the authors and still have a finished product.
I think that's really thoughtful, really good stuff. So Crystle, for the next question, when you're working with somebody, like if you're a graduate student, your academic advisor, if you're a postdoc or you're a young scholar, maybe it's a more senior scholar, when you're co-authoring with them and you're waiting for feedback, when is it appropriate, or how do you approach, pushing them to make comments or give feedback, or if there's somebody who's, if they aren't quite moving at the pace you want them to be, how do you communicate that?
Well, I think one of the best ways is to establish a timeline, and that way, if you both agree on the timeline, you feel like you have some position, I think, to push a little, where you're like, okay, well, in order to get this paper in by X, we definitely need to get the revisions done by this date, so we really need need to do the comments sooner rather than later. And it all depends on who's first author and how you establish that to begin with. If you're first author, generally I would say you have you're in the position of your job is to get the paper done, and so that will naturally allow you to feel like you have a bit more space to move the paper along. But sometimes as the second author, if the paper isn't moving but you really want to get it done, you just need to I think be direct about it, but you can't you don't want to nag either. They can't be continual emails about it, but you want to make sure that you have a timeline established, that you're discussing it as you go, and that if it gets behind, you either have to make a decision to say, okay, it's behind, we're going to, move the deadline and, submit it for something else, or that you're going to, make up the time and finish it. And it has to be a conversation where, just after a certain amount of time, you can't just sit and wait anymore, or it doesn't go anywhere. You have to actually, assert that, I'm going to figure out if we're going to move this paper forward or not. And so, establishing authorship so you know what role you're kind of playing, and also having a timeline that you both agreed to, I think, are very helpful ways in order to move the paper forward in situations like that.
And I think the person who asked this question, they were talking specifically about working with your academic advisor and pushing back on revisions for them. So because I'm just finishing up my life as a grad student, and so this is something that I've been negotiating recently. So I'm going to speak specifically to the advisee-advisor role. And one thing I think is really important is know how to balance your asks. Like Crystle said before, you don't want to be naggy, and I think it's also important not to come off as needy or as really helpless. And so for me, before I ask my advisor for anything or before I ask her feedback, there are a couple things I try to do. I make sure that my advisor is the right person to go to. If a fellow grad student or a friend or colleague could help out with something, then sometimes I choose not to go to my advisor on some things, because when I do, really need her help, I want to make sure that, I've spaced out my asks. You don't want to ask for too many things or ask for things too often. But at the same time, there are some things where your advisor is the person to go to, and you really do want to make sure that you're getting feedback from them and communicating clearly with them. So I always try to sort of control the conversation. So when I ask for feedback, I'll write a really short email that's, all right, here's the status of where it's at, and here are the things that I specifically need you to touch base on. Here's what I need feedback on from you. Here are the things where I'm really unclear. And so if you can kind of learn to direct that conversation so you aren't just saying, here's the piece, here's the draft, and tell me what you think. Because, then your advisor needs to commit a lot more time to figuring out at what part of the process you're in or what you need from them. And so if you're very clear about, here's where the draft is right now, here's how I feel about it, and here's what I need from you, it's much easier for them to spend a little bit of time to give you the exact kind of feedback you need. And so I think particularly when working with advisors, learn how to direct the conversation in a way that doesn't waste their time and that gives you the type of feedback that you really need is an important skill to learn to develop, and it takes practice, but being thoughtful about that, I think, can go a long way.
Absolutely. I think those are great suggestions. And I think in general, whether it's with your co-authors, with people who you're, doing, peer-supported writing, whether it's with, a senior scholar or your advisor, definitely asking for specific types of feedback and explaining where you are in the process is very crucial to you getting the feedback that you're looking for and to actually getting helpful feedback. Because if you just give a paper to somebody and you're like, so here's my paper draft, it's a lot harder for others to know, is this an early draft? Do you think this paper is ready for publication? Where do you think you are in the process? So I think that framing it for others is a very great way to actually be able to get more specific feedback. And if you're working collaboratively, how do you handle difficult editing decisions in collaborative writing? For example, what sections to cut if you're trying to fit into a word limit, things like that.
Great question. I think I've said it before and I'll say it again. Communicating, you want to make sure you don't make someone feel alienated. It's easy, especially if it's something you've contributed to, it's easy to get really self-conscious and go, oh my gosh, they're cutting my section or something. So if you're the person who's most affected by a proposed change, try not to take it personally. Understand that this is a process with several people, and it is a process. Writing is a process. I think one of the key pieces of advice I would give to any writer is learn to be able to cut your own work. It doesn't mean that it's bad writing. Sometimes you need to put something out there that wasn't the right direction to take before you understand what the right direction was. And so learning to be comfortable with cutting your own writing or having other people suggest cutting sections, I think, is really important. And then if it's somebody else's part, where they were taking the lead, don't be a jerk about it. Understand that they put a lot of time and thought into it, and make sure that you're pointing out the value of the process and what someone's contributed, even if you are suggesting, say, cutting a chunk of their text or suggesting that you might want to take things in a different direction theoretically or whatnot. What do you think, Crystal?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd say that especially if you have to cut for word limit or if somebody's written a section and the paper changes focus and it no longer fits. One thing to be really upfront about it. You don't want to just cut the section out. You want to let them know that you're thinking that it's going to need to be cut. Explain to them why, and then you want to have, I think, depending on what stage you're in, like have everybody review what you're thinking about having cut, so that everybody can see the cuts are being made all over the place. That you're going, or that you're changing the direction of the paper somehow, or the direction of the paper has changed over time. So certain parts of writing, excuse me, just don't actually fit anymore. And you want to give the author the option, I think, to save those parts for themselves, like take them out and they can use them for something else if they feel really passionate about that writing. But in the end, I think that it's all about communication. It's about sharing the process and being very transparent, because I think you're more likely to end up with hurt feelings if you just go through and start cutting chunks out and then give it back to everybody and you're like, okay, so I cut half your section out and now the paper's done, because it is really disrespectful, and then people can't understand. They don't understand what got cut for what reasons, and it just makes the whole thing much murkier.
All right, that's great. And with about 10 to 15 minutes left, I think it's a good time to move on to our final section, which is kind of about your public image as a writer. And so, Crystal, how do you get people to read your published work?
I think sharing it on social media is really great. I like to let my peers know that I've published something, because sometimes, since most other academics teach classes, you never know when an article is going to fit something that they want to teach or fit something they're writing for. And it's one of those things. There are so many journals, especially in kind of interdisciplinary fields, that if you don't tell people that you've published something, they're most likely not going to know, because there are so many publications coming out all the time that it's hard for others to keep up. So sharing your work with people in your network who have similar work to yours is, I think, a great way of just letting others know that you're out there, you're active, what you're doing. And I love to see when my peers publish articles. It's always great to read related work, and it gives me more to potential articles to cite. You never know when somebody else's article is going to be that perfect article you're looking for to cite in something else you're writing. And so I think you have to advertise yourself, and you have to put yourself out there, both through your social network, through social media. I usually share it on my blog when I have something published, just so it's out there in another spot. And so I think it's like an important part of your, I think, professional practice is to move your work around to others. What do you think?
Absolutely, I agree with everything you said. I do think, like you say, it's really important to put yourself out there. I would recommend every young scholar and academic to have their own website. Don't go over ambitious about it. It's really easy to say, I'm going to start a blog and I'm going to post on it every week. And for most of us, you're not. And that's because you have, if you're a grad student, you have, seminar papers and papers to write. You have conference submissions coming up. You've got journals that you're trying to publish in. You might have book chapters due. Don't be overambitious saying I'm going to keep everything up to date all the time on my website. But having a good static web page that has a relatively up-to-date bio that's just like 1 or 2 paragraphs of what you're all about, what your research is, who you are, what you care about, and what institution you're at, obviously. And then I try to keep a pretty up-to-date version of my CV online so that people can see where I've presented, what I've published. You want a website version of your CV, so I don't have personal things like my phone number or address on it. My most recent research is about women in the game industry, which, if you're familiar with the recent Gamergate controversy, has been, it's a topic that has gotten some people a lot of unwanted attention. So be careful of what is online about you. Google yourself frequently, like not all the time, but a couple times a year, Google yourself to see what comes up when people look me up, and make sure you're controlling that. Have a website that has your publications on it, your CV on it, and your description of what it is that you do, what you care about. I'm a big fan of Twitter, so when I get something published or have something I want people to see, I tweet about it and try to make sure that my friends who it's particularly relevant to, know about it. Another way to get your stuff read, talk to the people who are teaching or TAing classes. I think that of the people I know and the young scholars that I know, people who are teaching classes are always looking for a new article on X, changing up their teaching routine, because no one wants to use the same syllabus 8 semesters in a row. And so a great way to get people reading your recent work is to see if somebody who's teaching a class that it's relevant to might have their students read your article.
Absolutely. So anything else you'd like to add?
I think that pretty much covers it. Just make sure you invest time. I know it's easy when you're an academic to think, I have to read this, I have to write this, I have to edit this, and to think that things like building a website or tweeting aren't important. And I fell victim to that kind of in my graduate student lull, where in the middle of grad school, I wasn't really tweeting, I didn't have a website up, or if it was, it wasn't at all up to date. And now I've realized that it really is worth investing in. Put in the time to regularly upkeep your public image. Make sure your CV on your website's up to date. Update that bio that hasn't been updated in 2 years. You're probably not doing what you were doing 2 years ago. You probably care about different things. So invest the time in doing that, because then when people look you up and they're like, oh, what is so-and-so about, you want them to see a sort of fresh, well-organized version of yourself out there. Because otherwise, if it looks like a website from 15 years ago, and some academics have websites up that look like they're from 15 years ago, then that doesn't do you any favors in trying to expand your network and be known as a serious scholar, emerging scholar in your field.
Absolutely, and I would also say that one other thing that I think kind of goes with this is, taking the chance of doing things like writing blog posts for, academic-oriented blogs, or trying to write an op-ed, things like that, that take your research and put it into a different context, that are, not necessarily easier publications to find. I would not describe them as that. It's a very different style of writing, but it's also a way to get your writing in front of, a much different audience than it would usually reach. And I think that's very important. And it definitely goes with your, your public identity as an academic, which I agree with everything Amanda said is vital to, I think, your ability to grow your network and have your work out there in the world in a very positive light.
One more thing I would add is, if you're trying to grow your network, follow the people whose work you like, and really find them online. Find their LinkedIn, find their Twitter handles, respond to them occasionally. That's a really good way to network. Respond to the things that they post about and they care about. I also use academia.edu. I know there are other similar sites out there, so find the one that's best for you. But that's a place where people post their most recent articles and book chapters, and download or comment on the stuff that's most relevant to your field. I actually just got an email notification about somebody in my network posted a book chapter on academia.edu this week, and so I went and downloaded it this morning. And I think a lot of those sites actually show who's looking at your work or downloading it, and so use resources like that both to put your own stuff out there, but also to grow your network by following the people whose work you want your work to be in conversation with.
Yeah, and I would say that adding that about academia.edu, they've recently added a feature where people can ask their networks to comment on draft papers, and so that's kind of an interesting way. If, you're following a scholar and they send out a notice that they put up this paper for feedback, it gives you a chance to offer suggestions to someone who you might not have made that kind of contact with before, and gives you the potential to develop some new relationships with people who you are connected with in the social media sense, but may not be connected with in more personal levels. And so it gives you opportunities to work with people that you might not get the opportunity to otherwise. So I think that's about it. We want to thank you all for joining us. To keep up to date with what's going on with the DML Commons, sign up for the newsletter at dmlcommons.net or watch the hashtag DMLCommons on Twitter. Next week is the start of Unit 4, and we hope you'll join Adam York, Dixie Ching, and Rafa Santo for the ACK to Alt ACK and everything in between, identifying meaningful jobs and career pathways. We'll see you then.
Bye.